Instead, she uncovered a hidden vault containing over $3 million in Confederate gold that had been lost for 160 years and sparked a legal battle that would change everything. Eleanor Hayes had spent 43 years organizing other people's stories as head librarian at Richmond Public Library, but at 70, her own story felt like it was coming to an unplanned and financially devastating conclusion. Sitting in the cramped waiting room of Whitman Associates Law Firm on a sweltering August morning, she clutched a manila envelope containing the most unwelcome inheritance she could imagine. Her great-uncle Cornelius Hayes had been the family eccentric, reclusive antique dealer who had owned a massive explosive brick warehouse in Richmond's historic district for over 50 years. Eleanor had seen him perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, usually at funerals where he would appear in an ancient black suit, nod politely at relatives, and disappear before anyone could engage him in conversation. Cornelius was gone, and somehow his will had left Eleanor the sole inheritor of a 15,000-square-foot warehouse that came with $127,000 in outstanding property taxes, a condemned building notice from the city, and structural problems that would cost more to fix than Eleanor's entire retirement savings. At 70, Eleanor was supposed to be enjoying the golden years she'd carefully planned during 4 decades of modest library wages. Instead, she faced the prospect of bankruptcy, losing her small apartment, and spending her final years dependent on relatives who were already struggling with their own financial challenges. The warehouse sat like a massive burden in Richmond's Fan District, its red brick walls weathered by decades of neglect and its windows boarded up like closed eyes. The building had been Cornelius's antique warehouse and restoration workshop, filled with decades of accumulated furniture, artifacts, and what the city inspector had diplomatically termed significant hoarding issues. Eleanor's modest fixed income from her library pension couldn't begin to cover the tax debt, let alone the estimated $200,000 in repairs needed to bring the building up to code. The city had given her 60 days to either bring the property into compliance or face demolition proceedings that would leave her responsible for cleanup costs exceeding $50,000. But it wasn't just the money that broke Eleanor's heart. It was the realization that she, who had spent her career preserving knowledge and history for future generations, might be forced to destroy the last physical remnant of her family's connection to Richmond. The Hayes family had lived in Virginia since before the Civil War, and this warehouse represented the final chapter of their presence in the city where her ancestors had lived, worked, and died for over 2 centuries. Harrington Development Group had been circling the property like vultures since before Cornelius died. Marcus Harrington III, whose family had built an empire converting historic buildings into luxury condominiums, had already approached Eleanor twice with offers to purchase the warehouse. His proposals were generous enough to pay off the tax debt and leave her with a modest profit, but they came with the certainty that another piece of Richmond's authentic character would be erased forever. Mrs. Hayes, Marcus had said during their last meeting, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. I understand the emotional attachment to family property, but sometimes the kindest thing we can do for a building is to preserve its best elements while adapting it for modern use. His vision for the warehouse involved gutting the interior, adding glass and steel, contemporary elements, and creating 30 luxury units that would sell for half $1 million each to young professionals who wanted to live in a authentically historic building that bore no resemblance to its original purpose. Eleanor's silence during that meeting had apparently been interpreted as negotiation strategy, because Marcus had since increased his offer twice and began mentioning the various regulatory complications that could arise if the property transfer was delayed too long. The threat was subtle but clear. Accept Harrington's offer now, or face escalating bureaucratic obstacles that would make independent ownership impossible, while draining Eleanor's remaining resources through legal and regulatory costs. Standing outside the warehouse on this oppressive August afternoon, Eleanor felt the weight of 7 decades pressing down on her shoulders. She had been the good daughter, the responsible sister, the dedicated public servant who had put duty before personal desires for her entire adult life. Now, in what should have been her peaceful retirement, she faced losing everything because of one relative's eccentricity in her own stubborn refusal to surrender family history to corporate development. But Eleanor Hayes had not survived 7 decades, including the loss of both parents, a failed marriage, and a career in public service. By giving up when circumstances became difficult, standing before the massive wooden doors of Cornelius's warehouse, she made a decision that would change everything. She would spend whatever time she had left exploring what her great-uncle had devoted his life to collecting. And she would find a solution that honored both family legacy and financial reality. Tomorrow, she would begin the daunting task of cataloging 50 years of accumulated antiques, artifacts, and family memories. She had no idea that hidden within that overwhelming collection lay secrets that would connect her to one of the most dramatic episodes in American history and provide the means to save not just the warehouse, but her entire future. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she fitted the heavy brass key into the warehouse's main entrance. The lock mechanism was old, but well-maintained, a typical of Cornelius's attention to detail regarding anything he considered important. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the building itself was eager to reveal its secrets after months of enforced silence. The massive wooden doors swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from decades past, releasing a rush of air that carried scents Eleanor couldn't immediately identify: old wood, leather, metal polish, and something else that reminded her of the rare book collection at the library. But underneath those familiar aromas lay other scents that spoke to the warehouse's long history: tobacco from its original purpose, machine oil from various industrial uses, and the indefinable smell of time itself. Stuff hey by Aaron and David. I'm sure to reveal score with LSL. You won't say pay will. Oh, I pay. Also rund. Pay. Felt like crossing into another world. The warehouse's interior was far larger than Eleanor had imagined from the outside, with soaring ceilings supported by massive wooden beams that spoke to the craftsmanship of an earlier era. Weak afternoon sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, creating cathedral-like shafts of dusty illumination that revealed glimpses of the extraordinary collection Cornelius had accumulated over 5 decades. Eleanor had expected chaos, the random accumulation of a man who couldn't bear to throw anything away. Instead, she found organization on a scale that took her breath away. The warehouse was divided into distinct sections, each one focused on specific historical periods or types of items. Furniture from different eras was grouped together with museum-like precision. Military artifacts were displayed in cases that protected them from dust and moisture. Documents and books were stored in climate-controlled cabinets that rivaled the preservation systems at major libraries. This wasn't hoarding. This was curation on a professional level that suggested Cornelius had possessed expertise far beyond what his family had ever suspected. The main floor contained what appeared to be the public face of his antique business: furniture, decorative items, and collectibles arranged in room-like displays that allowed potential customers to envision how pieces might look in their own homes. But Eleanor could see staircases leading to upper levels and doorways that opened into additional rooms, suggesting that the warehouse contained far more than what visitors would have been allowed to see. As she moved deeper into the building, Eleanor began to understand why the city inspector had cited overcrowding issues. Every available space was filled with carefully preserved items, but the arrangement was so methodical that she could navigate between displays without difficulty. Cornelius had created pathways and viewing areas that allowed access to his collection while maximizing storage efficiency. But the sheer volume of accumulated material was overwhelming. Even with Eleanor's professional experience organizing large collections, she estimated that properly cataloging everything in the warehouse would require months of full-time work. She had 60 days to either save the building or lose it to demolition. And she was one 70-year-old woman facing a task that would challenge a team of professional archivists. The magnitude of what Cornelius had accomplished began to sink. As Eleanor explored room after room of carefully organized historical artifacts, each section revealed new evidence of his sophisticated understanding of historical value and preservation techniques. Civil War military equipment was stored using museum-standard methods that prevented corrosion and decay. Victorian-era furniture was protected with custom-fitted covers that allowed air circulation while preventing dust accumulation. Documents and photographs were housed in acid-free containers that would preserve them for centuries. Cornelius had clearly invested significant money in proper storage materials and climate control systems. The warehouse's temperature and humidity were carefully regulated to protect sensitive materials. And Eleanor could see evidence of recent upgrades to the building's environmental systems. This wasn't the work of an eccentric collector operating on a limited budget. This was a sophisticated preservation operation that had required substantial financial resources and professional expertise. Moving through the warehouse's main floor, Eleanor began to notice items that carried personal significance beyond their historical or monetary value. A display case near the center of the room contained military artifacts that included uniforms, weapons, and documents from the Civil War period. But these weren't generic Confederate memorabilia. They were items that bore the name Hayes on various labels and identification tags. Eleanor approached the case with growing fascination and unease. Inside, carefully preserved behind museum-quality glass, lay items she recognized from family stories but had never seen in person. A Confederate officer's sword bore an engraved inscription, Captain William Hayes, 23rd Virginia Infantry, 1863. The brass buttons on a gray wool uniform jacket carried the Virginia state seal and showed the careful maintenance that suggested they had been treasured rather than merely preserved. But the most startling discovery was a collection of personal letters tied with a faded ribbon. The top envelope addressed in careful script to Captain William Hayes, Richmond, Virginia. These were letters to her great-great-grandfather, written during the Civil War by family members whose names Eleanor recognized from stories passed down through generations. Cornelius had somehow acquired and preserved family artifacts that Eleanor had assumed were lost forever. But how had he obtained these items? And why had he never mentioned their existence to other family members who would have treasured the connection to their Civil War ancestor? The answers began to emerge as Eleanor explored additional display cases. Cornelius had been conducting his own family genealogy research for decades. But unlike amateur genealogists who focused on names and dates, he had been systematically acquiring physical artifacts that documented the Hayes family's presence in Virginia. Military records, property deeds, business correspondence, and personal effects created a comprehensive archive of family history that spanned from the 1840s to the present day. Eleanor found documentation showing that Cornelius had purchased family items from estate sales, private collectors, and even other family members who had inherited items they didn't value or couldn't afford to maintain. He had been quietly reassembling the material legacy of the Hayes family, preserving artifacts that would have been lost to time, neglect, or simple lack of appreciation for their historical significance. But this revelation raised troubling questions about Cornelius's motivations and methods. Had he been hoarding family history because he believed other relatives couldn't be trusted to preserve it properly? Had his reclusiveness been driven by a desire to protect valuable artifacts from family members who might sell them for quick cash? Or had he been pursuing some larger purpose that required keeping his activities secret? Eleanor discovered detailed records that Cornelius had maintained regarding his family acquisitions. His files showed that he had been tracking Hayes family artifacts for over 30 years, purchasing items whenever they appeared at auctions or estate sales. Some purchases had cost substantial amounts of money. A Civil War family Bible had cost $3,200. A collection of letters from Captain William to his wife had required $1,800. And a set of military documents had been purchased for $2,400. The financial records revealed that Cornelius had spent tens of thousands of dollars assembling his family collection. often outbidding other collectors and even museums to acquire items with Hayes family connections. His dedication to preserving family history had been far more extensive and expensive than anyone in the family had ever suspected. But the records also showed that Cornelius had been selective in his acquisitions, focusing particularly on items related to Captain William Hayes's military service in the immediate post-war period when the family had struggled to rebuild their lives. This concentration suggested that Cornelius had been researching specific aspects of family history rather than simply collecting anything with a Hayes connection. As Eleanor spent her first full day exploring the warehouse, she began to appreciate the sophisticated organizational system Cornelius had developed. Each section of the building was devoted to specific historical periods, with subsections organized by geographical region and type of artifact. The Civil War materials occupied an entire corner of the main floor, but Eleanor could see sections devoted to colonial period items, Revolutionary War artifacts, Victorian-era furniture, and even 20th century collectibles. But the organization went beyond simple categorization. Cornelius had created detailed card catalogs, physical index systems like those. Eleanor remembered from her early library career that cross-referenced items by date, origin, previous ownership, and historical significance. Each artifact had been photographed, measured, and documented with the precision of a professional museum curator. The scope of his knowledge was remarkable. His catalog entries included detailed historical context for each item, information about original owners, and connections to larger historical events or trends. A simple Confederate canteen, for example, was documented not just as military equipment from the Civil War, but as an item carried by a specific soldier from a particular Virginia regiment that had participated in identified battles. This level of documentation suggested that Cornelius had been conducting original historical research for decades, using his antique dealing as a cover for more serious scholarly work. But if his research had been producing valuable historical insights, why had he never published his findings or shared them with academic institutions that could have benefited from his knowledge? Eleanor discovered that Cornelius had maintained correspondence with historians, museum curators, and other collectors throughout the country. His files contained letters from professors at major universities who had consulted him about specific artifacts or historical questions. Several museum directors had written requesting information about items in his collection that related to their institutional research projects. But despite this evidence of scholarly recognition, Cornelius had apparently never allowed anyone to visit his warehouse or examine his collection in person. All his professional correspondence had been conducted through letters, photographs, and detailed written descriptions. He had been willing to share his knowledge, but not his actual artifacts, maintaining the same secrecy with academic professionals that he had shown with his own family. This pattern of behavior suggested that Cornelius had been protecting something more valuable than individual artifacts. His reluctance to allow personal examination of his collection indicated that he feared discovery of items or information that he didn't want to become public knowledge. On her second day in the warehouse, Eleanor made a discovery that suggested Cornelius's collection might contain treasures beyond anything she had yet imagined. While examining a section devoted to Civil War documents, she found a small, locked cabinet that seemed different from the other storage units. The cabinet was made from heavy wood with brass fittings that showed careful maintenance, and its lock was more sophisticated than the simple latches used on other display cases. The cabinet's label, written in Cornelius's precise handwriting, reads simply, "Personal Effects, CWH, Restricted Access." Eleanor recognized the initials Charles Wesley Hayes, Cornelius's grandfather and Eleanor's great-grandfather, who had been born just after the Civil War ended and had lived until 1952. Eleanor had heard family stories about Charles Wesley, who had supposedly inherited items from his father, Captain William, but had been secretive about what those items contained. Family legends suggested that Captain William had brought something valuable home from the war. But Charles Wesley had never discussed the specifics with his children, and the items had disappeared after his death. Now, Eleanor wondered if those mysterious family heirlooms had actually passed to Cornelius, who had preserved them in this locked cabinet for over 70 years. But the cabinet's sophisticated lock system suggested that whatever lay inside was more valuable than typical family memorabilia. Eleanor spent considerable time trying to locate a key for the cabinet, searching through Cornelius's desk and checking the key ring that had come with the warehouse. But none of the available keys fit the cabinet's lock, and Eleanor lacked both the tools and the expertise to open it without potentially damaging whatever lay inside. The locked cabinet became a source of growing fascination and frustration. Eleanor's professional experience had taught her that people only secured items with expensive locks when those items possessed extraordinary value, either monetary, historical, or personal. But without access to the cabinet's contents, she could only speculate about what Cornelius had considered important enough to keep locked away from even his own family. Eleanor found additional evidence that Cornelius had been particularly secretive about certain aspects of his collection. Several display cases contained empty spaces with labels indicating that items had been relocated for security purposes. The relocated items appeared to have been valuable pieces, military artifacts, documents, and personal effects that had been removed from general display and presumably secured in areas that she hadn't yet discovered.
All this selective security
Suggested that Cornelius had been protecting specific items that he considered more valuable or sensitive than the rest of his collection. But Eleanor couldn't determine what criteria he had used for deciding which items required special protection, or where those items had been relocated. While Eleanor struggled to understand the full scope of Cornelius's collection, external pressures continued to mount. Marcus Harrington called twice during her first week in the warehouse, each time expressing concern about her progress and offering to expedite the transition process if she was finding the property management overwhelming. Mrs. Hayes, Marcus said during their most recent conversation, his voice carrying subtle urgency beneath its professional courtesy. I want to make sure you're not feeling pressured to make hasty decisions about valuable family items. Harrington Development has extensive experience helping families transition inherited collections to appropriate new homes. The offer sounded generous, but Eleanor recognized the underlying message. Marcus was positioning his company to claim valuable items from the warehouse in addition to acquiring the building itself, sudden interest in helping her manage. Cornelius's collection suggested that someone had informed him about the potential value of the warehouse's contents. Eleanor's suspicions about outside interference were confirmed when she arrived at the warehouse one morning to find that someone had attempted to tamper with the rear entrance. The lock showed scratches that suggested someone had tried to pick it, and fresh footprints in the alley behind the building indicated recent unauthorized activity. The attempted break-in forced Eleanor to confront the reality that Cornelius's collection had attracted attention from people who might not respect legal ownership or proper procedures for handling historical artifacts. But the incident also suggested that the warehouse contained something valuable enough to justify criminal risk information that made Eleanor more determined to understand what her great-uncle had been protecting. Eleanor installed additional security measures, including motion-activated lights and a basic alarm system that would alert her if anyone attempted unauthorized entry. But she understood that these measures provided only limited protection against determined intruders, and that her real security lay in resolving the warehouse situation before criminal interest escalated into more serious threats. The break-in attempt also made Eleanor realize that word about Cornelius's collection was spreading through communities that she couldn't monitor or control. Antique dealers, collectors, and even criminals might be aware of the warehouse's contents and could be planning more aggressive attempts to claim valuable items. During her exploration of Cornelius's files, Eleanor discovered evidence that her great-uncle had been part of an extensive network of researchers, collectors, and historians who shared information about Civil War artifacts and lost Confederate treasure. His correspondence files contained letters from people throughout the South who were pursuing similar research interests. The network appeared to have been informal, but highly organized, with members sharing information about potential treasure locations, historical research, and opportunities to acquire significant artifacts. Cornelius had been a respected member of this community, often consulted by other researchers for his expertise in authentication and historical context. But Eleanor also found evidence that the research network had been investigating stories about Confederate treasure that had never been recovered. Several letters discussed specific legends about Confederate gold that had been hidden during the war's final months. When Southern military leaders had attempted to preserve valuable resources from capture by advancing Union forces, one particularly detailed letter described research into the movements of Confederate Treasury agents during April 1865, when Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders had fled Richmond with substantial amounts of gold and silver. The letter's author had been tracking specific individuals who had been responsible for hiding portions of the Confederate treasury, and had identified potential locations where treasure might still be concealed. Cornelius had apparently been contributing to this research, sharing information about Confederate military movements in Virginia, and providing authentication services for artifacts that other network members had discovered. But his letters suggested that he had been more interested in the historical aspects of the treasure stories than in actual treasure hunting. Eleanor found no evidence that Cornelius had personally participated in treasure hunting expeditions or had discovered anything significant through his network activities. His files contained theories, maps, and speculation, but no documentation of actual discoveries or recoveries. This apparent lack of success made Eleanor wonder why. Cornelius had continued to invest time and effort in treasure research for decades. Had he been pursuing purely academic interests, or had he believed that his research might eventually lead to valuable discoveries? And if he had never found anything significant, why had he maintained such elaborate secrecy about his research activities? During her second week in the warehouse, Eleanor made a discovery that changed her understanding of Cornelius's activities and suggested that his collection contained secrets far beyond anything she had yet imagined. While exploring the building's upper levels, she found a heavy door marked Private Research, Authorized Personnel Only, that was secured with multiple locks and showed recent signs of use. The door was different from other entrances throughout the warehouse, heavier, more substantial, and equipped with security measures that seemed disproportionate to protecting antique furniture or typical collectibles. The lock system included both traditional key locks and what appeared to be a more modern combination mechanism, suggesting that Cornelius had upgraded the security for this particular room within recent years. Eleanor's attempts to locate keys for the research room proved futile, but her examination of the door and surrounding walls suggested that the space behind it was substantial, possibly a large room or a series of rooms that had been completely sealed off from the rest of the warehouse. The fact that Cornelius had invested in such elaborate security measures indicated that whatever lay behind the door was far more valuable than anything she had yet discovered. But the secured research room also raised troubling questions about what Cornelius had been doing during his final years. Had he been conducting activities that required such secrecy? Was he protecting legitimate historical research, or had his collecting activities crossed into areas that might have legal or ethical complications? Eleanor's professional instincts told her that people only created such elaborate security measures when they were protecting something that could change their lives or destroy them. But without access to the research room, she could only speculate about what secrets Cornelius had died protecting. Eleanor found additional evidence that the secured room had been actively used during Cornelius's final months. Fresh scratches around the lock mechanisms suggested recent access, and she discovered a logbook near the door that showed entries dated within weeks of Cornelius's death. The logbook entries were cryptic, consisting mainly of dates and abbreviated notes that Eleanor couldn't interpret without additional context. But the existence of recent activity in the secured area suggested that Cornelius had been working on something important during his final period, possibly completing research projects or securing valuable discoveries that he had been protecting for years. As Eleanor continued exploring the warehouse, she began to notice patterns in Cornelius's collection that suggested his activities had been more systematic and purposeful than simple antique dealing. The Civil War materials, in particular, showed evidence of focused research into specific military units, battles, and individual soldiers from Virginia regiments. Cornelius had assembled detailed files on dozens of Confederate officers and enlisted men, including service records, personal correspondence, and post-war activities. but his research seemed particularly concentrated on officers who had served in specific roles: quartermasters, supply officers, and men responsible for managing valuable military resources during the war's chaotic final months. Eleanor found maps annotated in Cornelius's handwriting that showed the movements of particular Confederate units during 1864 and 1865, when the Southern cause was clearly failing and military leaders were making desperate decisions about how to preserve valuable resources from capture by advancing Union forces. Some maps included notes about asset disposition and emergency protocols that suggested Cornelius had been researching how Confederate forces had handled valuable materials when retreat or surrender became inevitable. The research files also included correspondence with other collectors, historians, and even metal detector enthusiasts who had been searching for lost Confederate treasure throughout Virginia and other southern states. Cornelius had apparently been part of a network of people who shared information about potential locations where valuable items might have been concealed during the war's final months, but Eleanor found no evidence that Cornelius had personally participated in treasure hunting expeditions or had discovered anything significant through his research activities. His files contained theories, maps, and speculation, but no documentation of actual discoveries or recoveries. This apparent lack of success made Eleanor wonder why Cornelius had invested so much time and effort in researching Confederate treasure stories. Had he been pursuing academic interest in Civil War history, or had he believed that his research might eventually lead to valuable discoveries? And if he had never found anything significant, why had he continued the research for decades, while maintaining such elaborate secrecy about his activities? Eleanor discovered that Cornelius's research had been particularly focused on the activities of Confederate General Joseph Wheeler and his cavalry units during the final months of the war. Wheeler's forces had been responsible for protecting Confederate supply trains and treasury shipments as Southern armies retreated through Virginia and the Carolinas. Cornelius had assembled detailed information about Wheeler's movements, including maps, battle reports, and correspondence that documented the general's efforts to preserve Confederate resources from capture. Some documents suggested that Wheeler had been specifically ordered to conceal valuable materials in secure locations, with plans to retrieve them after Confederate fortunes improved. But Eleanor also found evidence that Wheeler's forces had been overwhelmed by the rapid collapse of Confederate resistance, leaving many hidden caches unrecovered when the war ended. Cornelius's research suggested that substantial amounts of Confederate gold and silver remained hidden throughout the region, waiting for someone with sufficient knowledge to locate and recover them. As Eleanor's third week in the warehouse began, the approaching deadline created increasing pressure to make decisions about the building's future. She had learned enough about Cornelius's collection to understand that it possessed significant historical value, but she still lacked the specific information needed to determine whether that value could save the warehouse from demolition. The financial mathematics remained brutally clear. She needed at least $200,000 to pay taxes and essential repairs, plus additional funds to maintain the building while developing a long-term preservation plan. Even if Cornelius's collection contained items worth substantial money, converting that value into cash would require time she didn't have and expertise she didn't possess. Marcus Harrington's latest offer had reached $550,000 for the warehouse and adjacent properties. With additional provisions to help Eleanor manage the disposal of Cornelius's collection, the offer was generous enough to solve all her immediate financial problems while leaving her with substantial money for a comfortable retirement. But accepting the offer would mean destroying everything Cornelius had spent 50 years building, scattering a historically significant collection, and ending the Hayes family's presence in Richmond after 4 generations. Eleanor understood that some decisions, once made, could never be undone, and selling to Harrington Development would permanently end any possibility of preserving her family's legacy. Standing in the warehouse surrounded by 5 decades of carefully accumulated history, Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical force. She was the last Hayes with any connection to Richmond, the final guardian of family artifacts that spanned from the Civil War to the present day. Whatever decision she made would determine not just her own future, but the fate of everything previous generations had worked to preserve. The mysterious locked cabinet and sealed research room suggested that Cornelius had been protecting secrets that might change everything. But Eleanor couldn't base her decision on speculation about what those secrets might contain. She needed allies with expertise in historical artifacts, people who could help her understand what she had inherited and develop a realistic plan for preservation. Tomorrow, Eleanor would begin reaching out to the academic and museum communities, seeking expert assistance with evaluating Cornelius's collection and exploring options for preservation that might save both the warehouse and her family's legacy. She had no idea that her search for help would connect her to people who had been researching the same historical mysteries that had obsessed Cornelius for decades, or that together they would unlock secrets that had been hidden since the final desperate days of the Confederate States of America. The reluctant beginning was about to become an extraordinary adventure that would transform Eleanor's understanding of her family's history and provide the means to preserve everything she thought she might lose. But first, she had to find the courage to trust strangers with family secrets and embrace possibilities that seemed too extraordinary to believe. Eleanor's decision to seek professional help came after 3 weeks of overwhelming discoveries and mounting pressure. The warehouse contained treasures beyond her ability to evaluate, secrets locked behind doors she couldn't open, and mysteries that required expertise she simply didn't possess. Most importantly, the 60-day deadline meant she needed answers quickly, not the leisurely pace of academic research, but urgent professional assessment that could determine whether Cornelius's collection contained enough value to save the warehouse from demolition. Her first call was to Dr. Margaret Thornfield at Virginia Commonwealth University, professor of American history who specialized in Civil War studies and had written extensively about Confederate military operations in Virginia. Eleanor had discovered Dr. Thornfield's contact information in Cornelius's correspondence files, where several letters indicated that the professor had consulted with Cornelius about specific Civil War artifacts over the past decade. Professor Thornfield, Eleanor began carefully when she reached the university office. "My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I believe you may have corresponded with my great-uncle, Cornelius Hayes, about Civil War artifacts. I've recently inherited his collection, and I'm hoping you might be able to provide some guidance about its historical significance." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Cornelius Hayes.
Mrs.
Your uncle was one of the most knowledgeable private collectors I've ever encountered. His expertise in Civil War artifacts was remarkable, and his authentication skills were absolutely first-rate. I'm so sorry for your loss. He was truly dedicated to preserving American history. Dr. Thornfield's excitement grew as Eleanor described the scope of the warehouse collection. Mrs. Hayes, if what you're describing is accurate, your uncle assembled one of the most significant private Civil War collections in the country. I would be honored to examine his materials and provide whatever assistance you need for evaluation and preservation. But when Eleanor mentioned the locked areas and evidence of Confederate treasure research, Dr. Thornfield's tone became more cautious. Mrs. Hayes, I should mention that your uncle contacted me several times over the years with questions about Confederate treasury operations and the disposition of valuable military assets during the war's final months. He seemed particularly interested in the activities of specific Confederate officers who had been responsible for protecting valuable resources from Union capture. Dr. Thornfield paused before continuing. I always assumed his interest was purely academic, but if he was conducting active research into lost Confederate treasure, that changes the significance of his collection considerably. Such research, if successful, could have implications far beyond historical scholarship. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. Dr. Thornfield was confirming her growing suspicion that Cornelius had been pursuing something more valuable than academic knowledge, and that the locked areas of the warehouse might contain evidence of discoveries that he had been protecting until his death. Professor Thornfield, Eleanor said carefully, would you be willing to examine the collection in person? I'm facing some time constraints with the property, and I need expert assessment of what my uncle left behind. Absolutely, Dr. Thornfield replied without hesitation. This sounds like a collection of national historical significance. When would be convenient for you? They arranged to meet the following morning. But Dr. Thornfield's final comment added another layer of complexity. To Eleanor's situation, Mrs. Hayes, I should mention that if your uncle's collection contains significant Civil War artifacts, particularly anything related to Confederate Treasury operations, want to contact federal authorities about proper procedures for handling such discoveries. Items of that historical importance often fall under federal preservation guidelines. Dr. Margaret Thornfield proved to be a woman in her early 50s, with the focused intensity of someone who had devoted her career to understanding the past. She arrived at the warehouse driving a practical sedan loaded with camera equipment, measurement tools, and reference materials that suggested she took artifact evaluation seriously. Her gray hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she wore clothes that prioritized functionality over fashion someone prepared to spend hours examining historical materials in less than ideal conditions. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield said as Eleanor unlocked the warehouse doors. Gosh, I want you to know that I've been looking forward to this visit for years. Your uncle and I corresponded regularly, but he never allowed anyone to examine his collection. In person, he was remarkably secretive about his preservation methods and the full scope of his materials. Eleanor led Dr. Thornfield into the warehouse. Watching the professor's expression change from professional interest to complete amazement as the scope of Cornelius's collection became apparent, Dr. Thornfield moved slowly through the main floor, stopping frequently to examine display cases and organization systems with the critical eye of someone who understood both historical value and preservation techniques. This is extraordinary, Dr. Thornfield breathed after 20 minutes of initial exploration. Mrs. Hayes, your uncle, created a private museum that rivals major institutional collections. The organization, preservation methods, and documentation standards are absolutely professional grade. This isn't the work of an amateur collector. This is serious historical curation. Dr. Thornfield's expertise immediately elevated Eleanor's understanding of what she had inherited. The professor identified artifacts that Eleanor had overlooked, explained the historical significance of items that had seemed merely old, provided context that connected individual pieces to larger patterns of Civil War history. Look at this uniform, Dr. Thornfield said, examining the display case containing Captain William Hayes's military artifacts. The tailoring, fabric, and construction details are consistent with officers' uniforms from the 23rd Virginia Infantry. But more importantly, the preservation condition is remarkable. Most Civil War textiles have deteriorated significantly over the past 160 years. Your uncle used museum-quality preservation techniques that have kept these materials in pristine condition. But Dr. Thornfield's most significant observation came when she examined Cornelius's research files and documentation systems. Mrs. Hayes, your uncle was conducting original historical research at a level that would impress professional historians. His documentation methods, cross-referencing systems, and analytical approaches suggest formal training or extensive self-education in historical methodology. Eleanor shared her discoveries about the locked cabinet and secured research room, watching Dr. Thornfield's expression grow increasingly serious as the implications became clear. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield said carefully, the security measures you're describing suggest that your uncle was protecting discoveries or information that he considered extremely valuable. In my experience, people only invest in such elaborate concealment when they're safeguarding materials that could significantly impact their financial situation or historical reputation. Dr. Thornfield's examination of Cornelius's Confederate treasure research files confirmed Eleanor's suspicions about the sophistication of his investigations. Your uncle was part of a network of researchers who have been investigating documented cases of lost Confederate treasure for decades, but his approach was more systematic and scholarly than typical treasure hunters. He was applying serious historical methodology to stories that most academics dismiss as folklore. Dr. Thornfield's expertise provided crucial validation for Cornelius's research activities and suggested that his investigations might have been more successful than Eleanor had initially realized. The professor's examination of his files revealed evidence of sophisticated historical analysis that had identified specific locations where Confederate treasure might realistically be hidden. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield explained as she studied Cornelius's annotated maps and research notes. Your uncle was investigating documented historical events, not pursuing folklore or speculation. The Confederate treasury operations he was researching actually happened, and substantial amounts of gold and silver were definitely hidden during the war's final months. Dr. Thornfield provided historical context that made Cornelius's research activities seem more legitimate and potentially more successful. When Richmond fell in April 1865, Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders fled with portions of the Confederate treasury, gold and silver that had been accumulated to fund the war effort. But the rapid collapse of Confederate resistance meant that much of this treasure was hidden in emergency locations and never recovered. The professor's knowledge of Confederate treasury operations aligned perfectly with Cornelius's research focus. Your uncle was specifically investigating the activities of General Joseph Wheeler's cavalry units, which were responsible for protecting Confederate supply trains and treasury shipments during the final retreat. Wheeler's forces operated throughout Virginia and the Carolinas, and they definitely concealed valuable materials in multiple locations. But Dr. Thornfield's most significant revelation came when she examined some of Cornelius's more recent research notes. Mrs. Hayes, these documents suggest that your uncle may have identified specific locations where Confederate treasure was hidden. His notes reference geographic landmarks, property ownership records, and historical documentation that could pinpoint actual burial sites. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Thornfield continued her analysis. More importantly, your uncle's research appears to have been focused on treasure locations that remain on private property where recovery would be legally permissible. Most Confederate treasure stories involve locations that are now on public land or have been developed, making recovery impossible. But your uncle seems to have identified sites where treasure might still be accessible. Dr. Thornfield's expertise transformed Eleanor's understanding of the locked areas in the warehouse. Mrs. Hayes, if your uncle successfully located and recovered Confederate treasure, the locked areas of this building might contain discoveries worth millions of dollars. Confederate gold from the treasury operations would have enormous value both as precious metal and as historical artifacts. Dr. Thornfield's examination of Cornelius's correspondence files revealed that Eleanor's great-uncle had been part of a sophisticated network of researchers, historians, and collectors who had been investigating Confederate treasure stories for decades. But unlike amateur treasure hunters motivated by dreams of easy wealth, this network consisted of serious scholars who understood both the historical significance and legal complexities of recovering Civil War artifacts. Your uncle was in contact with some of the most respected Civil War historians in the country, Dr. Thornfield explained as she reviewed Cornelius's correspondence. These aren't treasure hunters. These are academics and museum professionals who have been researching documented cases of lost Confederate assets as legitimate historical investigations. The network's approach to Confederate treasure research was far more sophisticated than typical treasure hunting activities. Members shared information about historical documentation, collaborated on archival research, and consulted with legal experts about proper procedures for handling any discoveries. Their goal wasn't just to find treasure, but to ensure that any recovered materials were properly preserved and made available for scholarly study. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield said, this network has been investigating several documented cases where Confederate treasure was definitely hidden but never recovered. They've identified at least 12 locations in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina where substantial amounts of gold and silver were concealed during the war's final months. But Dr. Thornfield's most important revelation was that Cornelius had been considered one of the network's most valuable contributors because of his expertise in artifact authentication and his access to private collections that contained relevant historical materials. Your uncle's role in the network wasn't just research. He was helping authenticate artifacts and documents that other members discovered. His reputation for accuracy and integrity made him a trusted authority within the group. This information suggested that Cornelius's Confederate treasure research had been more successful than Eleanor had realized. If he had been serving as an authentication expert for other network members, he would have been among the first to know about any significant discoveries. and his expertise would have given him advantages in identifying and recovering treasure. On his own, Dr. Thornfield's examination of recent correspondence revealed that network activity had intensified. During Cornelius's final years, Mrs. Hayes. These letters suggest that the research network made several significant discoveries during the past 5 years. Your uncle was involved in authenticating artifacts and documents that other members recovered, and some of these discoveries appear to have been quite valuable. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of Cornelius's most recent files revealed evidence that suggested her great-uncle had been involved in successful recovering operations during his final years. The locked areas of the warehouse weren't just protecting research materials, they might contain actual Confederate treasure that Cornelius had helped locate and recover. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield said with growing excitement, these recent documents suggest that your uncle's research network achieved some remarkable successes. I'm seeing references to authenticated Confederate gold coins, recovered military artifacts, and even documents that were hidden with treasury shipments during the war. The professor's expertise allowed her to interpret Cornelius's cryptic notes and understand references that Eleanor had found meaningless. Your uncle was using professional archaeological terminology in his recent documentation. Terms like field recovery, artifact authentication, preservation protocols suggest that he was handling actual discoveries, not just conducting theoretical research. Dr. Thornfield found evidence that Cornelius had been serving as the primary authentication expert for Confederate artifacts recovered by network members throughout the Southeast. Mrs. Hayes, your uncle's reputation for accuracy made him the person that other researchers contacted when they needed reliable evaluation of potential discoveries. If someone found Confederate coins, military artifacts, or historical documents, they brought them to your uncle for authentication. But the most significant revelation came when Dr. Thornfield discovered documentation suggesting that Cornelius had established a private authentication and preservation facility within the warehouse. These references to laboratory analysis, chemical preservation, and secure storage protocols suggest that your uncle created professional-grade facilities for handling valuable historical artifacts. Eleanor realized that the locked research room might contain not just Cornelius's own discoveries, but valuable artifacts belonging to other network members who had entrusted him with authentication and preservation services. The room might be a private museum containing Confederate treasure recovered from multiple locations throughout the region. Professor Thornfield, Eleanor asked carefully, if my uncle was handling authentication for recovered Confederate treasure, what would be the legal status of materials stored in his facility? Dr. Thornfield's response was both encouraging and cautionary. Mrs. Hayes, Confederate treasure recovered from private property generally belongs to the property owner or the person who discovers it, assuming proper legal procedures are followed. But artifacts of significant historical importance often fall under federal preservation guidelines that require appropriate handling and documentation. The professor's expertise provided Eleanor Hayes with crucial information about the potential value of whatever lay behind the locked doors. If your uncle's research network was successful in recovering Confederate treasury gold, the value could be extraordinary. Confederate coins from treasury operations have sold for tens of thousands of dollars each, and complete collections could be worth millions. Dr. Thornfield's examination of Cornelius's equipment and facilities revealed that Eleanor's great-uncle had established professional-grade capabilities for artifact authentication and preservation that rivaled those of major museums. The warehouse contained specialized equipment for chemical analysis, photographic documentation, and environmental preservation that represented substantial financial investment and technical expertise. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield explained, as she examined Cornelius's laboratory equipment, your uncle invested in analytical tools that most private collectors could never afford. This spectroscopic analysis equipment can determine the age and composition of metals with remarkable precision, exactly what you'd need for authenticating Civil War-era artifacts. The professor's discovery of Cornelius's documentation systems revealed the scope of his authentication activities. Your uncle maintained detailed records for every artifact he examined, including photographs, analytical results, and historical provenance research. These records show that he authenticated hundreds of Civil War artifacts over the past 20 years, many of them extremely valuable pieces. But Dr. Thornfield's most significant finding was evidence that Cornelius had been authenticating artifacts for museums, universities, and private collectors throughout the country. Mrs. Hayes, your uncle's reputation extended far beyond his research network. Major institutions were consulting him about Civil War artifacts and his authentication. Certificates were accepted by auction houses and collectors as definitive proof of authenticity. This revelation transformed Eleanor's understanding of Cornelius's activities and suggested that his authentication business had been generating substantial income. That could explain his ability to maintain the warehouse and acquire expensive preservation equipment. Professor Thornfield, are you saying my uncle was operating a professional authentication service? Absolutely, Dr. Thornfield replied. Your uncle was one of the most respected Civil War artifact authenticators in the country. His expertise was so well regarded that people would ship valuable items from across the nation for his evaluation. This wasn't just a hobby, this was a serious professional operation. Dr. Thornfield's examination of recent financial records revealed that Cornelius's authentication services had been generating six-figure annual income during his final years. The locked research room likely contained authentication equipment, client records, and possibly valuable artifacts that belonged to customers who had died or lost. Contact before retrieving their materials. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of the most recent correspondence in Cornelius's files revealed that his research network had achieved a major breakthrough during the months before his death. The letters contained references to a significant recovery operation, an authentication of extraordinary materials that suggested the network had successfully located and recovered substantial Confederate treasure. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield, said with barely contained excitement. These documents suggest that your uncle's network located one of the major Confederate treasury caches that they had been researching for decades. The terminology they're using indicates a discovery of national historical significance. The professor found evidence that Cornelius had been serving as the primary authenticator for this major discovery, which would explain the increased security measures and secretive behavior during his final months. Your uncle was responsible for verifying the authenticity and historical provenance of whatever the network recovered. That level of responsibility would justify extraordinary security precautions. Dr. Thornfield's expertise allowed her to interpret references that had been meaningless to Eleanor. These mentions of Wheeler materials, treasury documentation, and field preservation protocols suggest that the network recovered artifacts directly connected to General Wheeler's cavalry operations and the Confederate treasury shipments they were protecting. But the most significant revelation was Dr. Thornfield's discovery of documentation, suggesting that the network's major discovery had included not just gold and silver, but historical documents and artifacts that could provide unprecedented insight into Confederate military operations during the war's final months. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield explained. If your uncle's network recovered documents that were buried with Confederate treasury shipments, those materials could contain information about Civil War events that historians have never been able to document. Such documents would be priceless from a scholarly perspective regardless of any monetary value. The professor's analysis suggested that the locked research room might contain the most significant collection of authenticated Confederate treasury materials ever assembled in private hands. Is accurate? Your uncle may have been protecting discoveries that could rewrite our understanding of Confederate military operations and treasury management during the Civil War's final phase. Dr. Thornfield's expertise in Civil War history also included knowledge of the legal complexities surrounding Confederate treasure discoveries, and her advice provided Eleanor with crucial information about the proper procedures for handling whatever lay behind the locked doors. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield explained. Confederate treasure recovered from private property generally belongs to the discoverer, but significant historical artifacts often fall under federal preservation guidelines. The key is ensuring that any discoveries are properly documented and reported to appropriate authorities. The professor's experience with similar discoveries provided Eleanor with realistic expectations about the process of handling major Civil War finds. If your uncle's research network recovered substantial Confederate treasure, the authentication and legal documentation process could take months or even years. But properly handled discoveries typically result in significant financial compensation for the discoverers, while ensuring that historically important materials are preserved for scholarly study. Dr. Thornfield's most important advice concerned the need for additional expertise in handling whatever Eleanor might find in the locked areas. Mrs. Hayes, if the research room contains major Confederate discoveries, you'll need legal representation, archaeological expertise, and possibly federal consultation before proceeding. The value of such materials could be extraordinary, but proper handling is crucial for protecting both your legal rights and the historical integrity of any discoveries. The professor's knowledge of similar cases provided encouraging precedents. I've seen Confederate treasure discoveries result in multi-million-dollar compensation for the discoverers, while ensuring that the historical materials are properly preserved and made available for scholarly research. But success depends on following proper legal and archaeological procedures from the beginning. Dr. Thornfield's final recommendation was that Eleanor seek additional expert assistance before attempting to access the locked areas. Mrs. Hayes, you need a team that includes legal expertise, archaeological methodology, and federal consultation. The potential value of your uncle's discoveries justifies professional. Handling that will protect both your interests and the historical significance of any materials. Dr. Thornfield's examination of Cornelius's collection and research materials had provided Eleanor with crucial information that transformed her understanding of what she had inherited. The warehouse didn't just contain valuable antiques. It potentially housed one of the most significant Confederate treasure discoveries in American history, along with the research network's decades of scholarly investigation. But Dr. Thornfield's expertise also made clear that Eleanor faced decisions that would determine not just her own financial future, but the fate of historically significant materials that belonged to the American people. The professor's advice about proper procedures and expert assistance provided is a roadmap for accessing the locked areas while protecting both legal rights and historical integrity. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield said, as she prepared to leave the warehouse, what you've inherited is far more valuable than a collection of antiques. Your uncle spent decades assembling materials that could change our understanding of Civil War history, and he may have been protecting discoveries that represent the culmination of serious scholarly research, but realizing that value will require careful planning and expert assistance. Eleanor understood that Dr. Thornfield's expertise had provided validation for pursuing the locked areas. Elevald had also revealed the complexity of properly handling whatever lay behind those secured doors. She needed additional allies with complementary skills, legal expertise, archaeological methodology, and federal connections that could ensure proper handling of major historical discoveries. Standing in the warehouse, surrounded by 5 decades of accumulated history, Eleanor felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders with new urgency. Dr. Thornfield's expertise had confirmed that the locked areas might contain treasures, valuable enough to save the warehouse and secure her financial future. But it also revealed that success would require professional handling that she couldn't provide alone. The search for expertise had become the search for a team capable of unlocking secrets that could change everything. Eleanor's next step would be assembling allies with the knowledge, skills, and resources needed to access Cornelius's final secrets, while ensuring that any discoveries were handled with the respect and professionalism that American history deserved. Tomorrow, Eleanor would begin building the team that could help her unlock the greatest mystery of her 70 years and possibly one of the most significant Civil War discoveries of the modern era. But first, she had to find the courage to trust strangers with secrets that could transform her life and preserve her family's legacy for future generations. Dr. Thornfield's expert assessment had transformed Eleanor's understanding of her inheritance from overwhelming burden to extraordinary opportunity, but it had also revealed the complexity of properly pursuing what might be one of the most significant Civil War discoveries in modern history. Standing in the warehouse after the professor's departure, surrounded by evidence of Cornelius's decades of sophisticated research, Eleanor faced the most important decision of her 70 years. The rational choice would be to sell the warehouse. To Marcus Harrington, take the guaranteed money, live comfortably on the proceeds, without risking everything on speculation about locked rooms and Confederate treasure. At 70, Eleanor had earned the right to choose security over adventure, certainty over possibility. But Eleanor Hayes had spent 43 years preserving other people's stories, and she understood that some opportunities once lost could never be recovered. If the locked areas of the warehouse contained the discoveries that Dr. Thornfield suspected, selling to developers would mean destroying treasures that belonged not just to her family, but to American history itself. More importantly, Eleanor realized that her great-uncle had spent 50 years preparing for this moment-accumulating expertise, building networks and protecting secrets until the right person could carry his work to completion. Cornelius had chosen her as his heir not because she was the most convenient family member, but because he believed she possessed the character and intelligence to understand what he had been protecting. The choice became clear as Eleanor studied the cryptic notes and maps that Cornelius had left behind. She would pursue the locked secrets of the warehouse, but she would do it properly, with expert assistance and professional procedures that honored both her uncle's research and the historical significance of any discoveries. But embracing this adventure meant accepting risks that could destroy her financially and emotionally. If the locked areas contained nothing more valuable than family memorabilia, Eleanor would have wasted crucial time and resources pursuing fantasies instead of practical solutions. If the discoveries proved legally complicated or ethically questionable, she could face problems that would make her current financial crisis seem simple by comparison. Eleanor's decision crystallized as she stood before the locked research room, studying the sophisticated security measures that Cornelius had installed to protect his final secrets. Whatever lay behind that door was valuable enough to justify extraordinary precautions, and important enough that her uncle had been willing to take those secrets to his grave rather than reveal them prematurely. We would unlock Cornelius's secrets, but she would assemble a team of experts who could handle discoveries of national historical significance. While protecting her legal rights and financial interests, the adventure would begin with careful preparation and professional consultation. It's not reckless treasure hunting that could destroy valuable evidence or create legal complications. Dr. Thornfield's advice about legal complexities prompted Eleanor to seek consultation with an attorney who specialized in historical artifacts and cultural property law. Her search led her to James Mitchell, no relation. Despite the shared surname, a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who had built his practice around cases involving archaeological discoveries, museum acquisitions, and the complex federal regulations governing historically significant artifacts, James Mitchell proved to be a man in his early 40s with the practical intelligence of someone who had spent his career navigating the intersection of historical scholarship and federal law. His office was filled with books about cultural property law, archaeological ethics, and landmark cases involving treasure discoveries and their legal aftermath. "Mrs. Hayes," James said during their initial phone consultation, "Dr. Thornfield briefed me about your situation, and I want you to understand that you're potentially dealing with some of the most complex areas of federal law. Confederate treasure discoveries fall under multiple jurisdictions and regulatory frameworks that most people, including many lawyers, don't fully understand." James's expertise immediately provided Eleanor with crucial information about the legal landscape surrounding her situation. The good news is that Confederate artifacts recovered from private property generally belong to the property owner or discoverer, assuming proper procedures are followed. The challenging news is that proper procedures involve federal notifications, archaeological documentation, and preservation requirements that can be quite complex. The lawyer's experience with similar cases provided Eleanor with realistic expectations about the legal process she would face. "Mrs. Hayes, if your uncle's collection contains significant Confederate treasury materials, you're looking at a process that could take months or years to resolve completely. But properly handled cases typically result in favorable outcomes for the discoverers, with fair compensation and appropriate historical preservation." James's most important advice concerned the need for federal consultation before accessing the locked areas. The National Park Service and other federal agencies have specific protocols for handling major Civil War discoveries. Consulting with them before proceeding will protect your legal rights and ensure that any discoveries are properly documented and preserved. But James also provided encouraging information about the financial potential of properly handled discoveries. I've represented discoverers who received multi-million-dollar compensation for Civil War artifacts, while ensuring that historically, significant materials were preserved for scholarly study and public education. The key is following proper procedures from the beginning and working with agencies that understand both legal requirements and historical value. The lawyer's expertise extended beyond legal requirements to practical advice about managing discoveries of extraordinary value. Mrs. Hayes, if the locked areas contain major Confederate discoveries, you'll need secure storage, insurance coverage, and professional authentication before the legal process can even begin. The value of such materials justifies substantial investment in proper handling and protection. James's final recommendation was that Eleanor assemble a complete team of experts. Before attempting to access the locked areas, you need archaeological expertise for proper excavation and documentation, historical specialists for authentication and context, and federal liaison for regulatory compliance. The potential value justifies professional handling at every level. James Mitchell's recommendation led Eleanor to Dr. Sarah Chen. It's an archaeologist who specialized in Civil War sites and had extensive experience with artifact recovery and preservation. Dr. Chen worked as an independent consultant after retiring from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and her expertise included both field archaeology and the complex federal regulations governing historically significant discoveries. Dr. Chen proved to be a woman in her late 50s with the methodical approach of someone who had spent decades handling irreplaceable historical materials. Her background included work on major Civil War battlefields, consultation with the National Park Service, and experience with private discoveries that required federal oversight and documentation. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Chen said during their first meeting at the warehouse, Dr. Thornfield and James Mitchell have briefed me about your situation, and I want you to understand that you're potentially dealing with one of the most significant Civil War discoveries of the modern era. But realizing that potential will require archaeological procedures that protect both the historical integrity of any discoveries and your legal rights as the property owner. Dr. Chen's examination of the locked research room provided professional support. Assessment of the challenges involved in accessing Cornelius's final secrets. The security measures your uncle installed suggest that he was protecting materials of extraordinary value. But we need to approach this methodically to avoid damaging evidence or compromising the archaeological context of any discoveries. The archaeologist's expertise revealed that Cornelius had been following professional archaeological standards in his own research activities. Your uncle's documentation methods and preservation techniques are consistent with professional archaeological practice. This suggests that any discoveries in the locked areas will have been properly handled and documented according to scientific standards. Dr. Chen's most important contribution was developing a systematic approach for accessing the locked areas. While maintaining archaeological integrity, we need to document everything before we disturb anything. Use proper excavation techniques that preserve contextual information, and maintain chain of custody procedures that will satisfy federal requirements for handling significant historical artifacts. But Dr. Chen also provided realistic timelines for the archaeological process. Mrs. Hayes, if the locked areas contain major discoveries, the archaeological documentation process could take several weeks. But proper documentation is essential for authentication, legal protection, and historical preservation. Rushing the process could compromise the value and legal status of any discoveries. The archaeologist's experience with federal agencies provided Eleanor with confidence about regulatory compliance. I've worked with the National Park Service and other federal agencies on numerous Civil War discoveries, and they're generally supportive of properly conducted private research. The key is transparency, professional methodology, and willingness to work within established preservation frameworks. Dr. Chen's recommendation led Eleanor to contact Robert Harrison, a recently retired official from the National Park Service, who had spent his career managing civil war sites and overseeing the federal response to significant archaeological discoveries. Robert now worked as an independent consultant helping private parties navigate federal requirements while ensuring proper preservation of historically significant materials. Robert Harrison brought decades of experience with the federal agencies that would be involved in evaluating and regulating any major Civil War discoveries. His expertise included knowledge of preservation requirements, compensation frameworks, and the political considerations that influenced federal decision-making about privately discovered historical artifacts. Mrs. Hayes, Robert explained during their initial consultation. The federal government has established procedures for handling significant Civil War discoveries that balance historical preservation with fair compensation for discoverers. Procedures are designed to ensure that important artifacts are preserved for public benefit while recognizing the legitimate rights of property owners and discoverers. Robert's experience provided Eleanor with detailed information about the federal process she would face. If your uncle's collection contains significant Confederate Treasury materials, several agencies will be involved in evaluation and regulation. The National Park Service handles historical significance assessments. The Treasury Department deals with monetary artifacts, and the Justice Department oversees legal compliance. But coordinating these agencies is manageable with proper preparation and professional representation. The former federal official's most important contribution was his knowledge of precedent cases that provided favorable models for Eleanor's situation. I've overseen several cases where private discoveries of Confederate artifacts resulted in substantial compensation for the discoverers, while ensuring proper historical preservation. The key is working within established frameworks rather than trying to circumvent federal oversight. Robert's expertise also extended to practical advice about managing the media attention that would inevitably accompany any major Civil War discovery. Mrs. Hayes, if you recover significant Confederate Treasury materials, this story will attract national media attention. Proper handling of public relations can enhance the value of your discoveries and build public support for fair compensation. But mismanaged publicity can create complications that interfere with the legal and archaeological processes. But Robert's most valuable service was his willingness to serve as an unofficial liaison with federal agencies during the discovery process. I can facilitate communications with the agencies that will be involved in evaluating your discoveries, help ensure that proper procedures are followed, and advocate for fair treatment throughout the federal review process. My relationships within the federal system can help expedite approvals and avoid bureaucratic complications. Team of experts unanimously recommended that Eleanor engage professional security services before attempting to access the locked areas. The potential value of Cornelius's discoveries, combined with the attempted break-in and growing awareness of the warehouse's contents, justified professional protection for both Eleanor and any artifacts they might recover. Dr. Chen's recommendation led Eleanor to Margaret Torres, a security consultant who specialized in protecting high-value archaeological sites and private collections. Margaret's background included military service, corporate security management, a specific experience with archaeological projects that required protection from both criminal threats and unauthorized access. Mrs. Hayes, Margaret explained, during their initial consultation, the security challenges you're facing are more complex than typical private security needs. You're protecting potentially invaluable historical artifacts. It's managing a discovery process that could attract criminal attention, and ensuring that any recovered materials remain secure until federal evaluation is completed. Margaret's expertise revealed security vulnerabilities that Eleanor hadn't recognized. The warehouse's location, size, and the nature of your discoveries create multiple security risks. Criminal organizations that specialize in high-value theft often monitor archaeological activities, particularly when significant discoveries are suspected. Additionally, the federal evaluation process could take months, during which time you'll be responsible for protecting materials worth millions of dollars. The security specialist's assessment provided Eleanor with comprehensive recommendations for protecting both the discovery process and any recovered artifacts. You need integrated security that includes electronic surveillance, physical barriers, and professional monitoring. But you also need security procedures that don't interfere with archaeological work or federal oversight activities. Margaret's most important contribution was developing security protocols that would satisfy federal requirements while providing practical protection. Federal agencies have specific requirements for the security of historically significant artifacts. During evaluation and authentication processes, meeting these requirements is essential for maintaining legal custody of any discoveries. But it also provides the level of protection that materials of this value require. But Margaret also provided sobering advice about the personal security implications of major archaeological discoveries. Mrs. Hayes, people who discover valuable artifacts often become targets for criminal attention. You'll need personal security measures as well as protection for the artifacts themselves. The value of major Confederate discoveries justifies extraordinary precautions. The complexity of managing discoveries worth potentially millions of dollars prompted Eleanor to seek consultation with a financial advisor who specialized in high-value asset management and the unique challenges facing people who suddenly acquired substantial wealth through inheritance or discovery. Patricia Williams, a certified financial planner with experience in estate management and asset protection, provided Eleanor with crucial advice about the financial implications of major archaeological discoveries. Her expertise included knowledge of tax obligations, insurance requirements, and estate planning considerations that would affect Eleanor's situation regardless of what lay behind the locked doors. Mrs. Hayes, Patricia explained, significant archaeological discoveries create immediate financial obligations and opportunities that most people aren't prepared to handle. Even before you know the exact value of any discoveries, you need to establish financial structures that will protect your interests and minimize tax obligations. Patricia's expertise revealed financial complexities that Eleanor hadn't anticipated. If you recover Confederate artifacts worth millions of dollars, the tax implications could be substantial. The IRS treats archaeological discoveries as taxable income at fair market value, which could result in tax obligations that exceed your liquid assets. Proper financial planning can help manage these obligations while preserving the maximum value of your discoveries. The financial advisor's most important service was establishing preliminary financial structures that would be ready to handle major discoveries. We need to create legal entities and financial accounts that can manage high-value assets, provide appropriate insurance coverage, and handle the complex financial transactions that accompany federal evaluation and compensation processes. Patricia also provided realistic financial projections based on comparable archaeological discoveries. Mrs. Hayes, if your uncle's research was as successful as the experts suggest, you could be looking at discoveries worth anywhere from $5 to $50 million. Managing wealth of that magnitude requires professional financial services and careful planning to ensure that the maximum value is preserved for your benefit and any charitable purposes you might choose to support. But Patricia's most valuable advice concerned the long-term financial implications of Eleanor's decisions. Mrs. Hayes, the choices you make during the next few months will determine your financial situation for the rest of your life. Proper handling of major discoveries can provide financial security beyond anything you've ever imagined. But mistakes during the discovery and evaluation process could cost you millions of dollars in potential compensation. After 3 weeks of consultation and planning, Eleanor had assembled a team of experts that provided comprehensive coverage of the challenges she would face in unlocking Cornelius's secrets. Dr. Thornfield brought historical expertise and scholarly credibility. James Mitchell provided legal knowledge and regulatory compliance. Dr. Chen offered archaeological methodology and federal liaison. Robert Harrison contributed federal experience and agency relationships. Margaret Torres delivered security, expertise, and protection services. Patricia Williams supplied financial planning and asset management. But beyond their individual expertise, the team members brought something equally valuable: mutual respect and collaborative experience that would allow them to work together effectively under pressure. Several team members had worked together on previous archaeological projects, and all of them understood the complexity of managing discoveries that involved federal oversight, media attention, and substantial financial implications. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Thornfield, said during the team's first collective meeting in the warehouse, "What you've assembled is probably the most qualified private archaeological team ever organized for a Civil War discovery. We have the expertise, experience, and federal relationships necessary to handle discoveries of national historical significance while protecting your interests and ensuring proper preservation of any artifacts we recover." The team's collective assessment of Eleanor's situation was both encouraging and sobering. They agreed that the evidence suggested Cornelius had been protecting discoveries of extraordinary historical and financial value. But they also emphasized that realizing that value would require months of careful work and substantial financial investment in proper procedures. James Mitchell provided the legal framework for proceeding. Mrs. Hayes, "We've established the legal structures necessary to protect your rights and handle discoveries according to federal requirements. The preliminary notifications have been filed with appropriate agencies, and we have agreements in place for proper archaeological documentation and federal liaison." Dr. Chen outlined the archaeological approach. "We've developed systematic procedures for accessing the locked areas while maintaining scientific standards that will satisfy federal requirements and preserve the maximum historical value of any discoveries. The process will take time, but it will ensure that we handle everything according to professional archaeological standards." Robert Harrison described the federal coordination strategy. "I've established preliminary contact with the agencies that will be involved in evaluating any discoveries, and I'm confident that we can navigate the federal process efficiently while ensuring fair compensation for any significant fines." Margaret Torres explained the security arrangements. "We have comprehensive security measures in place to protect both the discovery process and any recovered artifacts. The warehouse is now equipped with professional-grade surveillance and monitoring systems, and we have rapid response protocols for any security threats." Patricia Williams outlined the financial preparations. "We've established the financial structures necessary to handle discoveries of substantial value, including appropriate insurance coverage, tax planning strategies, and asset management systems that will preserve the maximum value of any recoveries." With expert consultation completed and comprehensive preparations in place, Eleanor faced the moment she had been anticipating and dreading for weeks. The team was ready to access the locked areas of the warehouse, but crossing that threshold would commit her irrevocably to an adventure that could transform her life or destroy her financially. Standing before the secured research room surrounded by experts who had staked their professional reputations on the significance of what lay behind the locked door, Eleanor felt the weight of 70 years pressing down on her shoulders. She had lived her entire adult life making careful, conservative decisions that prioritized security over adventure, responsibility over possibility. But Eleanor also understood that some opportunities came only once in a lifetime, and that the courage to embrace extraordinary possibilities was what separated people who merely survived from those who truly lived. Her great-uncle had spent 50 years preparing for this moment, assembling resources and protecting secrets until the right person could carry his work to completion. "Mrs. Hayes," Dr. Chen said gently, "are you ready to see what your uncle spent his life protecting?" Eleanor looked around the warehouse that had become the center of her world, taking in the careful organization and professional preservation that represented 5 decades of Cornelius's dedication to historical scholarship. She thought about Captain William Hayes, carrying secrets home from the Civil War that had shaped his family's destiny for generations. She thought about the Hayes family legacy that would end with her unless she found the courage to pursue possibilities that seemed too extraordinary to believe. Most of all, she thought about the child she had never had, the legacy she had never created, and the story she wanted her life to tell when it reached its final chapter. At 70, Eleanor Hayes was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her carefully planned, responsibly lived life. "Yes," Eleanor said, with quiet determination. "Let's see what Cornelius has been waiting to show us." The call to adventure had been answered. The team was assembled, the preparations were complete, and the locked secrets of the warehouse were about to be revealed. Whatever lay behind those secured doors would determine not just Eleanor's financial future, but her place in the ongoing story of American history and the Hayes family's connection to the founding and preservation of the nation. The greatest treasure hunt of the modern era was about to begin, and Eleanor, his 70-year-old retired librarian, last of her family line, guardian of generations of accumulated history, was ready to discover what her ancestor and her uncle had died protecting. The adventure that would define the final chapter of her life was beginning at last. The moment of truth arrived on a crisp, October morning when Eleanor's assembled team of experts gathered in the warehouse for what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Dr. Chen had brought professional lock-picking equipment and archaeological documentation tools, while Margaret Torres had established perimeter security that would protect the discovery process from unauthorized observation or interference. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she watched Dr. Chen work on the sophisticated lock mechanism that had protected Cornelius's final secrets for over a decade. The archaeologist's methodical approach took nearly an hour, carefully documenting each step of the process while preserving the lock mechanism itself as potential evidence of Cornelius's security measures. The lock is definitely custom-made, Dr. Chen observed as she worked. Your uncle invested in security hardware that would challenge professional locksmiths. Whatever he was protecting, he was determined that only someone with serious resources and expert assistance would be able to access it. The lock finally yielded with a series of precise clicks that seemed to echo across 2 centuries of accumulated history. Dr. Chen stepped back, allowing Eleanor the honor of opening the door that her great-uncle had sealed with such elaborate precautions. The heavy door swung open to reveal a sight that took everyone's breath away. The research room was far larger than anyone had anticipated, a space that had been completely renovated and equipped as a professional archaeological laboratory and secure storage facility. Climate control systems maintained perfect temperature and humidity for artifact preservation. Professional-grade lighting, illuminated work surfaces, and display areas that rivaled those of major museums. But it was the contents of the room that justified every security measure Cornelius had installed. Display cases lining the walls contained artifacts that represented the most significant collection of Confederate treasury materials ever assembled. In private hands, gold coins bearing Confederate stamps gleamed under the professional lighting. Silver ingots stacked in precise rows showed the careful organization that had characterized all of Cornelius's work. Military artifacts, documents, and personal effects created a comprehensive archive of Confederate treasury operations during the war's final desperate months. My God, Dr. Thornfield breathed, her professional composure finally cracking in the face of such an extraordinary discovery. This is beyond anything we imagined. This isn't just a treasure cache. This is a complete archaeological collection that documents Confederate treasury operations with unprecedented detail. Eleanor stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her great-uncle had accomplished. The room contained not just valuable artifacts, but the culmination of decades of scholarly research that had successfully recovered materials that historians had believed lost forever. At the center of the research room stood a massive vault that dwarfed even the elaborate security measures protecting the room itself. The vault was clearly modern, installed by Cornelius within recent years and equipped with electronic security systems that had been maintained until his death. A label on the vault door, written in Cornelius's precise handwriting, read simply, General Wheeler's Final Commission, Authentication Complete. Dr. Chen's examination of the vault revealed that it required both combination locks and biometric security that had been programmed to recognize Cornelius's fingerprints. But the archaeologist's expertise in artifact preservation included knowledge of security systems, and she was able to bypass the electronic locks using override procedures that Cornelius had documented in his research files. The vault door opened to reveal discoveries that would rewrite Civil War history and establish Eleanor as the heir to one of the most valuable private archaeological collections in American history. Inside, arranged with museum-quality care, lay artifacts that represented the final chapter of Confederate military operations and the desperate attempt to preserve Southern resources from Union capture. The centerpiece of the vault's contents was a collection of documents that bore the personal seal of Confederate General Joseph Gosteff. Wheeler and detailed his final orders regarding the disposition of Confederate Treasury assets during the war's chaotic conclusion. The documents were preserved in climate-controlled cases that had protected them for over 150 years, maintaining their historical integrity while ensuring their availability for scholarly study. But surrounding the Wheeler documents were artifacts that provided physical evidence of the Confederate Treasury operations. Gold coins minted specifically for Confederate military use. Silver ingots that had been cast from melted Southern silver, and personal effects belonging to high-ranking Confederate officers who had been responsible for protecting valuable military assets. Eleanor James Mitchell said with barely controlled excitement, "What we're looking at represents the most significant Civil War discovery since the recovery of the CSS Hunley. These artifacts don't just have monetary value, they provide documentary evidence of Civil War events that historians have never been able to verify." Dr. Thornfield's examination of the Wheeler documents revealed their extraordinary historical significance. These papers contain General Wheeler's detailed reports about Confederate Treasury operations, including specific locations where assets were concealed and the names of officers responsible for various caches. This information could lead to additional discoveries throughout the Southeast, but the most stunning revelation came when Robert Harrison examined the authentication documentation that Cornelius had meticulously prepared for each artifact. Mrs. Hayes, your uncle didn't just discover these materials, he spent decades verifying their authenticity using scientific methods that would satisfy any museum or federal agency. This collection has been professionally authenticated and documented, according to the highest scholarly standards. Eleanor's exploration of Cornelius's research files revealed that the Confederate Treasury discovery represented the culmination of his research network's decades of collaborative investigation. The locked vault contained not just artifacts that Cornelius had personally recovered, but materials that had been discovered and authenticated through the coordinated efforts of dozens of researchers throughout the Southeast. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of the network's research files showed the sophistication of their collaborative approach. Mrs. Hayes, your uncle was part of a scholarly network that spent over 30 years conducting systematic research into documented cases of Confederate treasure concealment. Their approach combined historical scholarship, archaeological methodology, and advanced authentication techniques to achieve results that individual researchers could never have accomplished alone. The network's success had been built on the principle of shared information and collaborative authentication. With Cornelius serving as the primary expert for verifying the historical significance and monetary value of discoveries made by network members throughout the region, his expertise had made him the unofficial curator of the network's most significant finds, and his warehouse had become the secure repository for materials too valuable to be stored in individual homes or private collections. Your uncle's role in the network was unique, Dr. Chen explained as she examined the documentation systems Cornelius had developed. He provided authentication services, secure storage, and historical research that enabled other network members to pursue discoveries that would have been impossible without professional support. In return, he became the custodian of materials that represented the collective success of the entire research community. The financial documentation revealed the staggering success of the network's treasure hunting activities. Over the past 20 years, network members had recovered Confederate assets with a combined authentication value exceeding $30 million. Cornelius's share of these discoveries, earned through his authentication and curation services, represented approximately the greatest treasure hunt of the modern era was about to begin. And Eleanor, his 70-year-old retired librarian, last of her family line, guardian of generations of accumulated history, was ready to discover what her ancestor and her uncle had died protecting. The adventure that would define the final chapter of her life was beginning at last. The moment of truth arrived on a crisp, October morning, when Eleanor's assembled team of experts gathered in the warehouse for what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Among the professionally curated Confederate collections, Eleanor made a discovery that connected her personally to the treasure story in ways she had never imagined. Hidden within the vault's most secure section lay a collection of artifacts that bore the Hayes family name and provided documentary evidence of her own ancestors' involvement in Confederate treasury operations. The family artifacts revealed that Captain William Hayes, Eleanor's Civil War ancestor, had been far more than a simple infantry officer. Documents authenticated by Cornelius showed that Captain Hayes had been specifically assigned to General Wheeler's staff during the war's final months, serving as one of the officers responsible for concealing Confederate treasury assets in secure locations throughout Virginia. Eleanor, Dr. Thornfield said with growing excitement, "Your ancestor wasn't just present at the end of the Civil War. He was one of the officers entrusted with hiding Confederate treasury materials. These documents show that Captain Hayes personally supervised the concealment of substantial gold and silver reserves at multiple locations in central Virginia. The family documents included detailed maps and location descriptions that Captain Hayes had prepared as official reports to his superiors, but had retained as personal records when the Confederate government collapsed before the locations could be recovered." Eleanor's ancestor had carried home not just memories of the war, but specific knowledge of where additional Confederate treasure remained hidden. But the most extraordinary discovery was Captain Hayes's personal journal, preserved in the vaults. Climate-controlled environment and containing detailed descriptions of his treasury concealment activities, the journal revealed that her ancestor had been specifically chosen for treasury duty because of his engineering background and his reputation for reliability under pressure. Your ancestor was protecting Confederate assets worth millions in today's currency, James Mitchell explained, as he examined the legal documentation surrounding the family discoveries. But more importantly, he was documenting his activities with the intention of ensuring that these materials could eventually be recovered for legitimate historical purposes. Among the professionally curated Confederate collections, Eleanor made a discovery that connected her personally to the treasure story in ways she had never imagined. Hidden within the vault's most secure section lay a collection of artifacts that bore the Hayes family name and provided documentary evidence of her own ancestors' involvement in Confederate treasury operations. The family artifacts revealed that Captain William Hayes, Eleanor's Civil War ancestor, had been far more than a simple infantry officer. Documents authenticated by Cornelius showed that Captain Hayes had been specifically assigned to General Wheeler's staff during the war's final months, serving as one of the officers responsible for concealing Confederate treasury assets in secure locations throughout Virginia. Eleanor, Dr. Thornfield said with growing excitement, "Your ancestor wasn't just present at the end of the Civil War. He was one of the officers entrusted with hiding Confederate treasury materials. These documents show that Captain Hayes personally supervised the concealment of substantial gold and silver reserves at multiple locations in central Virginia. The family documents included detailed maps and location descriptions that Captain Hayes had prepared as official reports to his superiors, but had retained as personal records when the Confederate government collapsed before the locations could be recovered. Eleanor's ancestor had carried home not just memories of the war, but specific knowledge of where additional Confederate treasure remained hidden. But the most extraordinary discovery was Captain Hayes's personal journal, preserved in the vaults. Climate-controlled environment and containing detailed descriptions of his treasury concealment activities, the journal revealed that her ancestor had been specifically chosen for treasury duty because of his engineering background and his reputation for reliability under pressure. Your ancestor was protecting Confederate assets worth millions in today's currency, James Mitchell explained, as he examined the legal documentation surrounding the family discoveries. But more importantly, he was documenting his activities with the intention of ensuring that these materials could eventually be recovered for legitimate historical purposes. The journal revealed that Captain Hayes had been deeply conflicted about his role in hiding Confederate treasury assets, understanding that the war was lost while recognizing his duty to preserve resources that might be needed for post-war reconstruction. His detailed documentation suggested that he had been planning to reveal the treasure locations to appropriate authorities once the political situation stabilized. Eleanor's most significant personal discovery came when she found that Cornelius had spent decades using Captain Hayes's journal and maps to systematically locate and recover the family treasure caches. The research room contained detailed documentation showing that Cornelius had successfully found and excavated at least 6 separate locations where their ancestor had concealed Confederate assets. The modern treasure recovery operation had been conducted with archaeological precision that preserved both the historical context and monetary value of the discoveries. Cornelius had documented each excavation with photographs, GPS coordinates, and detailed descriptions that would satisfy federal requirements for legitimate archaeological recovery. "Your uncle essentially completed your ancestor's mission," Dr. Chen observed as she studied the excavation records. Captain Hayes documented the treasure locations with the intention that they would eventually be recovered for historical purposes. Cornelius spent 50 years turning those intentions into reality. But the excavation records also revealed that Cornelius had not recovered all of the family treasure caches. The research files contained evidence of at least 3 additional locations where Captain Hayes had concealed Confederate assets, sites that Cornelius had identified but had not yet excavated before his death. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of the remaining sites suggested that Eleanor had inherited not just the Confederate treasury materials that Cornelius had already recovered, but also legal claim to additional treasure caches that could be worth millions of additional dollars. "Eleanor, your uncle left you a complete treasure map with professional archaeological documentation. The remaining sites represent the continuation of a family legacy that spans from the Civil War to the present day." The legal implications were extraordinary. James Mitchell's examination of the documentation revealed that Eleanor possessed legitimate claim to Confederate treasury materials based on both inheritance rights and her ancestor's original role in concealing the assets. "Mrs. Hayes, you don't just own what your uncle recovered, you have documented legal claim to. It's Confederate assets that your ancestor was officially authorized to protect during the war. Robert Harrison's preliminary notifications to federal agencies had prepared them for significant discoveries. But the magnitude of what Eleanor's team had uncovered exceeded even the most optimistic federal expectations. Within 48 hours of the vault opening, representatives from the National Park Service, Treasury Department, and Smithsonian Institution were requesting immediate meetings to assess the historical significance and federal implications of the discoveries. Mrs. Hayes, Robert explained as he coordinated the federal response, "What you've discovered represents one of the most significant Civil War finds in modern history. Federal agencies are treating this as a priority case that could provide unprecedented insight into Confederate military operations and treasury management." The federal assessment process moved with unusual speed. It's driven by the extraordinary historical significance of the discoveries and the professional quality of Cornelius's documentation. Dr. Thornfield's scholarly reputation, combined with Dr. Chen's archaeological expertise and James Mitchell's legal coordination, provided federal agencies with confidence that the discoveries had been handled according to appropriate professional standards. Within 2 weeks, federal experts had completed their preliminary evaluation and confirmed that Eleanor's discoveries warranted classification as nationally significant historical artifacts. The authentication process validated Cornelius's decades of scholarly work while establishing Eleanor's legal rights to fair compensation for her discoveries. The federal evaluation exceeded our most optimistic expectations, James Mitchell reported after the initial federal assessment was completed. "The agencies involved have confirmed that your discoveries represent legitimate historical artifacts with documented provenance and extraordinary scholarly value. More importantly, they've established compensation frameworks that recognize your rights while ensuring appropriate historical preservation." The federal compensation offer was structured to provide Eleanor with immediate financial security while ensuring long-term preservation of the most. Marcus Harrington's development plans for the warehouse and surrounding properties became impossible when Eleanor's discoveries attracted federal historical designation for the entire block. The National Park Service's determination that the warehouse qualified for National Historic Landmark status provided permanent protection against commercial development while enhancing the value of Eleanor's property rights. Mrs. Hayes, James Mitchell, explained with satisfaction. Federal historical designation has permanently protected your property from development pressure. Harrington Development's plans for luxury condominiums are no longer legally possible, and your property values have increased substantially due to the historical significance of your discoveries. The irony was perfect. Marcus Harrington's aggressive pressure tactics had motivated Eleanor to pursue the warehouse's secrets more quickly than she might have otherwise, ultimately leading to discoveries that made his development dreams impossible. While establishing Eleanor as one of Richmond's most significant property owners, federal historical designation also provided Eleanor with substantial tax advantages and preservation grants that funded the conversion of adjacent buildings into research facilities and visitor centers. The entire block became a destination for Civil War tourism that benefited the surrounding community while preserving the historical character that developers had planned to destroy. Margaret Torres's investigation had revealed that Harrington Development had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of the warehouse property, apparently aware of rumors about Confederate treasure, but lacking the historical expertise to pursue legitimate recovery. The attempted break-in and pressure tactics had been desperate attempts to gain access to discoveries that required decades of scholarly preparation to achieve. Eleanor's success in recovering and preserving her family's Confederate treasury legacy established her as a bridge between the Civil War era and the modern appreciation for historical preservation. At 71, she found herself managing educational programs, research partnerships, and museum operations that would ensure the discoveries remained available for scholarly study and public education for generations to come. The remaining treasure sites identified in Cornelius's research provided Eleanor with ongoing archaeological projects that continued to yield significant discoveries. Working with her established team of experts, she methodically excavated the additional caches that Captain Hayes had concealed, recovering artifacts that added millions of dollars to her collection while expanding scholarly understanding of Confederate treasury operations. Eleanor, Dr. Chen said as they planned the excavation of the final family treasure site, "You've become one of the most successful archaeological project managers in Civil War studies. Your systematic approach to treasure recovery has set new standards for combining historical scholarship with legitimate archaeological methodology." But Eleanor's most important legacy was the educational impact of her discoveries. The Hayes collection became a cornerstone resource for Civil War education, providing students and scholars with access to primary source materials that had never been available for academic study. Universities throughout the country developed research programs based on the collection, while elementary and high school classes used the artifacts to connect students with tangible evidence of American history. The collection also became a model for private historical preservation that inspired other families to pursue professional archaeological recovery of family artifacts and properties. Eleanor's success demonstrated that individual citizens could make significant contributions to historical knowledge while receiving appropriate financial compensation for their efforts and investments. Eleanor's exploration of Cornelius's personal papers revealed his final and most touching secret. He had been planning the discovery process specifically for her benefit for over a decade. His careful research into her career, personal character, and financial situation had convinced him that she possessed the intelligence and integrity needed to handle discoveries of national historical significance. Cornelius's private journal, discovered in his personal safe, contained detailed observations about Eleanor's work as a librarian and her dedication to preserving knowledge for future generations. He had chosen her as his heir, not because she was the most convenient family member, but because he believed she would understand the responsibility of caring for materials that belonged to American history. "Your uncle spent years preparing for this moment," Dr. Thornfield explained as she read Cornelius's final journal entries. "He assembled the expert network, developed the authentication systems, and created the security measures specifically to ensure that you would have the resources needed to handle major archaeological discoveries. Everything he did during his final years was designed to set you up for success. The journal revealed that Cornelius had been monitoring Eleanor's financial situation and had timed his death disclosure to coincide with her greatest need for alternative solutions. His apparent eccentricity had actually been careful planning to ensure that family treasures reached someone who would preserve them for historical benefit, rather than simply selling them for personal profit. But Cornelius's most profound gift to Eleanor was not the treasure itself, but the adventure of discovering it. His elaborate concealment and authentication systems had been designed to provide Eleanor with the experience of legitimate archaeological discovery, complete with expert consultation and professional recognition that acknowledged her role in preserving American history. 2 years after opening the locked vault, Eleanor Hayes had transformed from a financially struggling retiree into one of Richmond's most respected historical preservationists and one of the most successful treasure hunters in American history. The Hayes collection had become an internationally recognized repository of Civil War artifacts, while Eleanor's systematic approach to archaeological recovery had established new standards for private historical preservation. But Eleanor's greatest achievement was not financial or professional, it was personal. At 73, she had discovered that adventure and possibility remained available at any age, and that courage to pursue extraordinary opportunities could transform even the most carefully planned life into something remarkable and meaningful. The warehouse that had threatened to destroy her financial security had become the foundation for her greatest achievements. The family legacy that she had feared losing had been preserved and expanded beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. The careful, conservative life she had always lived had culminated in an adventure that connected her directly to American history and provided her with resources to support historical preservation for the rest of her life. Standing in the museum that had once been Cornelius's cluttered warehouse, surrounded by artifacts that spanned from the Civil War to the present day, Eleanor felt the satisfaction of someone who had honored both family legacy and historical responsibility. She had saved the warehouse, preserved the treasures, and ensured that future generations would have access to materials that documented one of the most dramatic periods in American history. The modest woman who had inherited a great-uncle's warehouse had become the guardian of one of the most significant Civil War collections in the country. The financial crisis that had threatened to end her family's presence in Richmond had instead established her as one of the city's most important historical preservationists. But most importantly, Eleanor Hayes had learned that it was never too late to embrace extraordinary possibilities, that courage could triumph over impossible circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were not the gold and silver hidden in locked vaults, but the adventures and achievements that came from having the wisdom to pursue them. The Hayes family legacy would continue for generations to come, preserved in artifacts and stories that connected the Civil War to the present day. And Eleanor Hayes, the last of her family line, had ensured that her name would be remembered, not as the Hayes who lost everything, but as the one who discovered treasures that had been waiting over a century for someone with the courage and character to find them. The greatest treasure hunt of the modern era had ended in complete victory, transformation, and the establishment of a legacy that would inspire treasure hunters and historical preservationists for generations to come. Eleanor Hayes had found not just Confederate gold, but the adventure that defined the final and most magnificent chapter of her carefully lived, extraordinarily concluded life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.